Hi, and welcome to Bootstrap, the lighter side, where entrepreneurs who have grown successful startups from the ground up share their inspiring stories. In each episode, you'll hear from accomplished founders about starting a business, managing a runway, and raising capital on their terms. I am Melissa Widner, the CEO of Lighter Capital, a leader in founder-friendly, non-dilutive funding. Visit lightercapital.com to learn more. Today, I'm talking with Dave Hersh, a general partner at Metamorph Partners and executive chairman at Monsoon Inc. Dave has been a founder, he's raised capital, taken companies public, and now he's focused on using his expertise to turn around businesses. He also has a new book coming out called Reignition. Welcome, Dave.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. First of all, I loved this book. I've got so much of it highlighted. It was just fantastic and so much resonated. A lot were things that I know and deeply believe, and it was great to be reminded of it. And others were things that were new sort of revelations. So thank you. But let's start with your background. How did you come into this entrepreneurial world?
I started my career as a management consultant, actually. So out of college, I worked for a boutique change management firm, and we used to help big companies start to become knowledge sharing companies. So this was back in the mid 90s. Lotus Notes was coming online. This was the first time we had collaboration technologies that could get everybody working on, the same playbook. So I was going around as a young consultant teaching these big companies how to act as one, as opposed to, the massively distributed, decentralized organizations that they were. And that played into both my entrepreneurial desires, but also what Jive became. So as I realized that I was not happy being a management consultant and wanted to be playing around with all the other entrepreneurs, I moved out to the Bay Area. And after a failed startup with some people, I ended up founding Jive with two guys that I worked with at the aforementioned failed startup. And Jive was really similar in concept, right? It was about bringing everybody together in one place to collaborate, whether it was customers, partners, employees. It was all about communication and collaboration in a way that reflected modern approaches to doing that. In a way, I was competing against those Lotus Notes types of implementations, which were antiquated.
And you started Jive in 2002, is that right?
2001.
2001, which was a tough time, very tough time to start a company.
Yeah, it forced us to bootstrap. My first day to go meet the founders was September 11th in New York.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Yeah, needless to say, there was not a lot of options for raising money after that. And so we bootstrapped it.
No.
They had done a great job building out an open source application. So they already had a lot of credibility and connections with developers. And so I helped them commercialize it and launch it as paid software back in the early days. And we just started making money out of the gate because we had to.
I mean, Jive went a long ways without raising any capital.
Yeah, we bootstrapped it for 5 years, built out a healthy, profitable $12 million business. And that was the time where we had a decision to make. We could keep doing what we were doing, or we could ride the social software, social media trend to something much larger, but we would have to raise money and go bigger if we wanted to do that. And so it's kind of a crucible moment for the company. Do we stay independent and bootstrapped, or do we raise money and go big? And we decided on the latter. And that meant raising money from Sequoia, end of lifing a lot of those old products. So in a way, starting to get rid of that $12 million of old revenue and trying to build up a whole new business with a new product that capitalized on our momentum and history, but was taking us in another direction in terms of the scope of the product and the customers we were selling to.
Tell us what happened, after going from being a bootstrap company, very successful, building 12 million in revenue in 5 years, to, taking on $15 million in capital from this top tier VC. How did the company change?
It changed pretty dramatically on a lot of fronts, as you can imagine. The strategy for the company now being one where we were trying to go up market and compete against IBM and Microsoft, having actual board and governance structure and the pressure that comes from that, having to hire very quickly And we were an S corp before, right? We were paying out profit sharing to everybody,
Yeah.
and it was just organizationally speaking, it was a lot of changes across a lot of different fronts. So I would say that there's a lot of good parts about that. At least it put us on the map. We had some extra cash, but there are a lot of bad parts too, which is with extra cash and that kind of pressure, you start forcing growth. Whereas before we were following growth, we were being pulled by the market into areas where they really needed us to go. When suddenly you're told to grow a certain amount over a certain period of time, then you start pushing for growth, which feels very different and oftentimes doesn't work. And that's where companies can get into a lot of trouble, ourselves included.
Let's go back to something you said earlier, having to hire quickly. So I was a VC for a long time, and I know that VCs put pressure on companies. One of a lot of the milestones companies will have are their goals or hiring goals, and will put pressure to hire quickly. Even very senior positions, I was surprised how much pressure we as VCs put on the founders to fill those senior positions quickly, because the thought was, you've got to get these positions filled in order to execute on the plan. But oftentimes when you're hiring quickly, you make the wrong hire, and that slows things way down. So talk about, what happened in your business in terms of headcount after you raised that 15 million, and how you went about hiring quickly.
So we raised the money in August of 2007 and immediately started hiring. One of the biggest challenges was that the existing leadership team had been built around the old business, which was more down market, smaller deal sizes, almost like an
Yeah.
SMB company. We were very much like Atlassian in the early days. They were a couple
Mm.
guys, we were three guys, and we kind of got started around the same time. And they continued to pursue that path where we made a decision to go more upmarket to enterprise customers. And we just weren't as experienced in that area. And so trying to build out a team that could support the needs of the enterprise was really challenging when it was reporting through to a leadership team that hadn't really done that before. And so you ended up hiring a lot of people who may look good on paper, but weren't the right people for the stage of company where we were. We were still a company that was in transition, trying to put itself on the map. And what happens for a lot of these companies, especially when you have product founders, is when they get to that stage, they do look at the operating plan and the growth that they told people they needed in order to get that cash in the door. Then they just hire whoever they can off the internet, right? And they get people who came from big companies like Oracle and Microsoft, who
Right.
again look good on paper, but are not right for that stage of company. And so that was the thing that happened to us. Is over the next several quarters, we tried to build up the team, but hired the wrong people and had the wrong management team in place to manage those people. And so a year later, when the economy hit the fan in 2008 and we had missed a couple quarters, I was forced to do a big layoff of a lot of the people that we had hired. And it was the right thing to do. And it reflected that period of time. But, I think there was a lot of waste that happened, after raising that money that could have been avoided if we had been able to follow our intuition a little better and less following the playbook of the venture investors.
So what happened then after? I mean, Sequoia put out, you would probably remember it because you're right, they're the one that put out the doomsday PowerPoint in 2008 or 2009, saying, things were going to be bad for a long time and companies need to hunker way down. But what was happening with Jive at that point?
We inadvertently became the poster child for that whole thing.
Okay.
Because my CFO was quoted in that presentation. We were front and center at the presentation. We were the first to do a big layoff. It was written about in the New York Times, and about how not to do a layoff and all these things.
Oh no.
So yeah, it was a rough period of time, but we cut out a third of the company. We were maybe 165 people, and I think we cut out 60 of those people. So it was even more than that, maybe 40% of the company. And the most fascinating part about that, and one of the themes of the book, was that after cutting that amount of people, we actually became more productive. So,
Yeah.
the first thing I learned was it didn't take that long for people to get past the layoff. And two, that they were more productive now than they had been. And they didn't have all these questions about people who weren't, able
Right.
to, do their job well, because those people were gone now. And three, that the putting in place of a new leadership team who had a lot more experience, which is what I did next, was warmly received by the team. And so we went into 2009 putting more cash into the business than we were spending. So we went into it in a cash flow positive way, and were quickly becoming the leader on all the Gartner and Forrester reports. And, so we were able to succeed on a large scale, beat our growth expectations with a smaller team and be profitable. And so, looking back on it, and what I talk about in the book is those periods of disciplined austerity when we had a really strong team, even if they were really small, that were following the pull of the market, and they were lean, disciplined, and driven towards a very specific purpose. Those were our most productive times. The times when we raised a bunch of money, spent a bunch of money, were the times when everything went sideways and we hired the wrong people and tried to push growth and it didn't work. And, that sadly continued after I left. And, the company went public, and it became an engine of trying to satisfy public investor demand of what they needed, as opposed to following intuition and innovation and trying to build something special in the world. It just became a veiled mechanism for hitting quarterly growth rates, which you can imagine kind of kills a lot of the energy inside of a company. So yeah, I think, part of me writing the book was saying, I'm not anti-VC by any means. And a lot of people have asked me that, but I am anti too much VC. And I am anti people following VC as the lemming-like path to building a company. In other words, if they try to say, well, we got to get to these metrics so we can raise a B round, and then we got to get to do these things, we can raise a C round, as if raising money is the goal. Ultimately a downward spiral that kills a lot of companies because they don't have the understanding of how the system works and the likelihood of success that you have by raising that much money.
So I think that's a story that isn't told enough. You get on this path of raising VC money, and it's all about the round and the valuation.
And I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who don't understand that venture capital is a 1 out of 10 hits business. That's how most of them make their money, is on 10 to 12% of their investments, which is fine for the VCs, but the entrepreneurs, that can obviously be problematic, and all the blood, sweat, and tears for the employees that go into them. And I just want people to understand the trade-offs inherent in doing that. And I literally, the call right before this, I just got off with an entrepreneur. She's great and starting a company right now. And she was like, the firms I keep talking to tell me I'm not raising enough money.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm sorry. You're doing the right thing. Follow your intuition. What does the company need? Let's start with that. What does the company really need? And if you could write the script for the next year and a half, let's figure out what that is. And then let's think about the right amount of capital and who it is and everything else. And so I think there is a system that gives rise to a certain type of thinking that is clearly problematic and doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Too much money really defocuses you. There's no bad idea. You'll chase everything. And I try to remind myself, if you have more than 3 priorities, you have none. So it's hard to succeed in any area when you're focused on several. And that's what can happen, and often does happen, when too much money is injected. And you make that point throughout the book, which I think is great. The other thing you talk about is the misconception that if you're competing with a company and they've raised $30 million, you've got to go raise 30 in order to be competitive.
Yeah, I think that's a scarcity mindset problem that affects a lot of entrepreneurs. Feeling like, well, we have to stay on the map. And I get it. There are cases where if it's a business that is based purely on responding to RFPs in a newly evolving category, you definitely want to have enough of a balance sheet to be able to sell to these big companies. But I think the truth is very different than what entrepreneurs think, and that you don't need to just match what competitors are doing. What you need is a strategy that reflects your unique core. What are you the best in the world at doing? And find ways to outcompete through things that your competitors could never do, things that you do really well. And so I think there's much more deft strategy at play in situations where companies come out on top, as opposed to funding to just stay on track with what other companies are doing. And I find that the creative strategies will get lost and buried under funding, because now you got a lot of people around the table who expect a lot. And that puts a lot of pressure on the founders to achieve at a certain level and to hit certain quarterly growth rates. And it becomes this form of theater over time where the CEO and founder is trying to present the company in its best light at board meetings and trying to make it look much bigger than it is.
Yeah.
And then the investors believe that what they're hearing,
Absolutely.
and then assume that the business is further along, and then tell, that it should now expand more aggressively. And so it's a form of theater that provides a very shaky foundation for real growth and for real value creation. And I think that's the thing that I see happen most often that creates the biggest problem.
Yeah, and I think it really takes away from the ability to work with your board and talk about the hard problems and work on solutions, because there is so much pressure to paint a rosy picture. And I know I've sat on a lot of venture-backed boards as a venture capitalist and as an independent director. And this isn't just the entrepreneurs driving it. I've seen countless examples of when the entrepreneur is trying to bring up, here's an issue or here's a potential problem that could be an existential threat to the business, and the VC is glossing over it because they need to have the happy story in order to get to the next round. So I think it doesn't really foster an environment of let's dig into what's difficult here and solve it together, which is too bad because typically those boards are made up with pretty smart, connected people that could actually play a role there.
Yeah, and it goes deep, meaning the VCs who are putting the money need the companies to tell good stories about how they're increasing the value, because that helps VCs raise more money when they do the next round. And then even the LPs who are investing in the VCs want a story that looks good because that helps.
They don't want down
rounds,
and right.
Yeah, right. And so there's this like massive infrastructure around perception management of what's happening at companies that masks the reality that most of these companies are still in learning mode, and they're being presented as if they are in we figured it out, let's scale it mode.
Yeah.
And this is hugely problematic. And so I see all the companies at the other end of this, right? I see all of the founders who are now beat up by having gone through this gauntlet, feel like a failure, feel like they messed up, and have this, I just wish I had known. So again, it's not about whether VC, but how much VC and for what purpose. If you are considering raising, if you're early in the process and you want to grow, let strategy be in the driver's seat, and funding can support that strategy. And if you've already gotten stuck, if you've made these decisions that got you to a place where you feel stuck, it's not too late. But if there's a real business under the hood, then things can happen to re-architect the company for its second act. You can have a near-death experience, but emerge from it much better for having been through it, and with a lot more purpose and focus and discipline in that second act. And so that, to me, that was what's most important, and why I tried to take all of my history as a bootstrapped entrepreneur, as a VC-backed entrepreneur, as a VC. I worked in VC for a while, worked in private equity for a while. I've seen it from every different angle, been an independent board member. And there were a lot of systemic challenges that I don't think need to be there getting in the way of these founders who just want to build something that matters.
Yeah, and look, I think it's important. VC gets most of the press. VC-backed companies get most of the press. But even in the tech world, it's 98% to 99% of technology companies never take VC funding. And not because they're necessarily choosing not to, but a lot of them just don't fit into what VCs are looking for, which is, grow fast and become a unicorn. So there's all these other companies out there, and that's where lighter capital plays for the most part. A lot of our companies take money from us and then go on to raise VC, but most of them stay bootstrapped and then have a nice exit, and the founder owns, most, if not all, of the company at the time of exit. But that's just not an exciting story, or as exciting as the company that sold for billions of dollars.
Right. Yeah. The problem is it's just really rare, and it's okay. I mean, if you are on a path where it becomes a billion-dollar company, right. And I get it, I've built one, I understand what that looks like, but for the stars to align in such a way that the market pulls you into areas where this can easily be $1 billion company. And, it's hard. And I think the longer you can go in a leaner, more disciplined approach, the higher likelihood you have to be $1 billion company. In other words, if you start raising too early before you understand what's really going on in the market and how you're going to play, then you're going to push yourself to a place, like we said before, where you're getting too much pressure to grow too quickly in your process. So I think if you can at least be more disciplined and walk before you sprint, that's a much higher likelihood of building something that has $1 billion potential than trying to, seed A round, B round, C round, and just try to like raise your way to forcing $1 billion valuation.
Yeah. Let's talk about what you're focused on now, or what you've been focused on for the last several years, which is helping companies get unstuck.
Yeah. So I started doing this as a consultant. I saw this big opportunity for this middle ground of companies. And so in the book, I describe it like middle distance runners, right? You have, short distance runners like the 100, 200, you have middle distance runners like 800, 1500, and you have long distance runners. This is these middle distance runners who are running these more strategic events where you have to pace yourself and draft on other runners. And it's really strategic about the way that you handle the track. These were people who were being forced to sprint out of the gate and were dying before they could finish their race.
Yeah.
So I'm writing it for those companies that are in this middle ground, and there's not a lot of playbook help for those companies, funding sources that are unique to 40 or 50% growers, or even 30% growers. And what do you do when you're in that case? So I wrote the book for them. And I feel like there's a lot more out there than we know about. And my business has become doing more of those. So originally started as a consultant, then I started buying companies with my own capital to start, and then teamed up with a guy named Bob Tinker a few years ago to buy larger companies. And when we find them, we would raise money to go fund the acquisition and restructure. And usually these are businesses that have a really solid core. There's a very healthy business, but it's been obfuscated by a lot of bad decisions or too much focus on growth and trying to go too big across too many markets too quickly. So if it's a business that didn't hit the venture growth trajectory, meaning they're not growing at 100 to 200% a year, but there's a good business under the hood, it's just not capitalized for that kind of business, that we would come in and do the acquisition and get it healthy, sustainable, purpose-driven, and help it grow into a place where everybody can do well. So at this point, I've written the book, and my life is a little bit about getting out there and spreading the message and meeting as many entrepreneurs as I can. I'm doing some consulting where I help companies that are in a situation where they're feeling stuck and need to know what to do strategically. And I'm also on the lookout for acquisition opportunities. So companies that just no longer have a capitalization structure that matches their trajectory, but they do want a second act. Especially those that, where the founder's still involved, there's still heart and soul in the business. It's not just a vessel for, making money, but there's people in the business who care deeply about why it exists, and they want to see it live a second life. Those are the businesses that I resonate with as a founder, as an operator, and trying to find them and help them orchestrate that path. So again, I will do it as a chairman where I'm actually orchestrating the whole buyout. I will do it as maybe a board member, an advisor, or sometimes even as a consultant. I just want to see these businesses succeed. And those are the things I just love working on.
Yeah. I want to get back to the book, a theme that came up repeatedly. You said, I've never regretted cutting deeper than was comfortable. And you talk about that a lot. And you gave a couple examples throughout the book, but what advice would you have for founders, knowing they're stuck and they need to change their cost structure? And I'll back that up with, companies almost always do this in multiple rounds, right? Before they get to the right number. And that's devastating for the culture to do 3 rounds of layoffs versus 1. But what can you say on that topic?
Yeah, there's a lot. In the book, I interview Victor Cho, part of the team that acquired Evite and got them restructured for healthy success. And he talks a lot about how important it is to direct as much of the money towards the future of the business. And what you see a lot of times with the founders is that they have a perception that their loyalty is most important and that this business is a complicated web of intricate parts, and if one part falls away, then the whole system starts to break down. Meaning they know that, well, if I fire Holly in marketing, then this thing is going to fall down, right? And if I fire Tim over here in customer success, then this project's going to die. And the founder CEO will have a lot of these elements of this intricate web in their mind, and they're so scared about the pieces falling apart that they don't cut as deeply as they can, versus an incoming CEO who doesn't know the business as well, and they'll come in and cut really aggressively. and,
Yeah.
and I think founders can learn a lot from that. And my experience is that you can operate these businesses on way fewer people than you think. I've come in and, cut 80% of the people and the business works fine. And it's surprising to people.
Yeah.
That can sound inhumane, but it's not. In fact, it's the opposite. And what we do is really treat people well on the way out, do everything you possibly can to support them, and run a very responsible, mature process. But after all is said and done, an amazing thing happens where the business coalesces around its new structure and the momentum is strong and they know that things were wrong. And when people see that you're actually putting money back into the business, it buoys them. It really gets them excited. They feel like they're winning the basketball game again, right? If you're just losing money and not hitting your goals quarter after quarter, it does not feel good. When suddenly, even if you have to go through this hard process of letting go of a lot of people who are friends and loyal supporters of the business, you can do it in a mature, responsible way that's empathetic and kind and takes care of the people as best you can, while recognizing that the business needs to go to a very different place. And so I try to help founders understand what that looks like, how deep you can go, how important it is to get to a place where you're profitable and sustainable, because that's when creativity happens. That's the open space where you can start to experiment with growth, where you can start to feel pull of the market, not feel pushed really hard, to go push growth upon a market that doesn't want your product. And it's that balance that I try to help founders or younger CEOs understand, that you need to direct these flows of capital towards where the business is going to go in the future. Otherwise, you're just going to be stuck, or you're going to run out of money, one or the other.
We have a lot of examples in the book, but I think Jody J. said, she talks just about the freedom you have when you are generating cash. It's the ability to even think strategically when you're generating cash versus worrying about getting more cash to make payroll, how much that changes. But that said, it's hard to make the deep cuts, especially I think one of the biggest challenges that CEOs have is they're worried about the culture, what effect that would have on the culture and the remaining people to see, a lot of their friends go. And I think that's sometimes the toughest piece to get over, especially in sort of sub 100 companies, sub 100 employee companies. I think a lot of it is the fear of, what's going to be left of the culture if a lot of cuts happen. So I don't know if there's any advice you have there.
Well, we could stay in relationships that aren't working either for a really long time, but it's not serving anybody that well, right? Yeah, we're avoiding hurting the other person in the short term, but why are we staying in the relationship? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know it's a different situation. However, the people know that things aren't working, right? And so when you just prolong it's not working situation out of misguided loyalty or some assumption that everything's going to fall apart if you have to make cuts, it's not doing anybody a service, right? The people aren't happy. They're not enjoying their work. They could be doing work that's more in line with what they want to do. They're not getting a chance to expand their horizons because there's too many people. And then they're just, they just kind of lose touch with why they're there, what they're doing, and the excitement around it. And so what I try to do is help entrepreneurs see that it is hard and there's no getting around that. And you will need to grieve the loss of these people. They are friends, they're loyal, they're wonderful people, but there kind of isn't another option. and I've done this, by the way. I've done the other side of it, which I've been a hero savior to businesses for a long
Yeah.
time, right? That's my thing. And I talk about that in the book, right? I prolong businesses just to try to
Yeah.
keep everybody together and keep it good. We can do this. We just get around one more corner, everything's going to be bright and sunny. And, that's not really the case. So it's better to call it what it is and to face it head on and to do one cut, not multiple cuts, and get the business back to a place where it is healthy, where it's getting more cash coming in the door than going out, and where you've got the time and space to lick the wounds, heal from the cut, get the team back around its core business and what it does best in the world. And then you can start experimenting with forms of growth that can support the core business, not be forced to do
Yeah.
it, but do it in a way where you can take your time to figure out the right offering for the right market and not have people breathing down your neck to do that. And you're not a failure just because you have to cut costs.
Right.
And I
Right.
think a
Exactly.
lot of people
Yeah.
that haven't been
You're
through that
you're
before,
saving the people who are left versus the
yeah.
others. So
And you can help those other people find jobs, and you can give
yeah,
them a chance
absolutely.
to go find a place that is going to be more accommodating to the way in which they want to grow and what they want to do. So you
Yeah.
can do it. And I think, it used to be companies were obviously like people got, they were lifers. You work for GE for life, and I think this idea of a company, at least newer generations understand that work is ephemeral and people come in and out and things change so quickly that I think, thankfully, that's, it's changing this. I have to be responsible for this group of people who owe their livelihood to me, and
Yeah.
that pressure that comes with that to a, you know what, no, it's okay. There's a lot of things out there. People need to move, things change, things happen all the time. And it's okay to cut deep, cut dramatically for the sake of saving the company. And almost always those founders, leaders are grateful later for having done it that way.
Yep. Almost always, right? You hardly ever hear the opposite.
Yeah.
And I think if you do it in a humane way and people understand you have their best interest at heart, you could a lot of times hire them back, when the growth on the other side. So we've seen that. One of my favorite parts of your book, and which by the way is again so well written, an easy read, and a very compelling book story, really, is our pages 54 through about 61, where you talk about, as a leader, taking an honest assessment of yourself. What makes you great? You put forward about, I don't know, 10 or 15 attributes, and you say pick the top three, and then understand that each of these has a shadow to it. So if one of your strengths is you're honest, the shadow side might be your oversharing, so understand your strength and understand what the shadow piece or the weakness is, because there's usually that yin and yang. But I just thought that was great. I went through and did the exercise myself, and I'm going to ask my team members to ask them for their opinions on this as well. So I'd say people don't have time to read the whole book, just read those pages, and it's a great exercise. But if you could walk us through what you do when you come in and are trying to help get a CEO entrepreneur unstuck, what's the first thing that you work on with that person?
Yeah. So the second chapter of the book that you're referring to is unique in that what I tried to do was go beyond the traditional reasons startups fail, right? We see these reports come out a lot. They're like, top 10 reasons startups fail and didn't get product market fit and founders didn't get along and ran into legal issues, things like that. And what I try to do is go underneath that and say, what are the psychological blind spots, the ego driven decisions that are leading to companies failing in this way?
Yeah.
And what happens that forces or drives entrepreneurs to success? Where does their motivation come from? And how does that motivation get in the way of the company's long-term trajectory? And what's going to happen is that if you don't deal with your own blind spots as a leader, you're going to repeat them. And so it's very important I start working with a new CEO to do that 360-degree review and find out what does make them special. Where does their motivation come from? What were the history of decisions that led to the company getting stuck? And why did they do that? And, through coaching with them, and it may be me, it may be an outsider, have them confront head on some of the insecurities and fears that gave rise to decisions like we raised too much money, we hired the wrong people, we grew too quickly in terms of people, we didn't listen to what was happening in the market, we were impulsive. What happened? And then start to peel it back. And it can be done in a very healthy way where it feels really good. It's hard to confront this stuff, but I think ultimately it feels really good because there's so much growth involved for the founder to say, yeah, I learned my lesson. We tried, and I'm going to change my ways, and I'm going to focus on growing in these areas so that I don't repeat the old patterns, and that this phase of the company is going to look very different. And it's important for them to do it for themselves and feels really good to do it. But it's also important for them to own it in front of the company and say, this first phase, and the reason we got stuck, I own that. I own these poor decisions, and we're not going to do this anymore. Here's how we're going to do things differently. And if you ever see me doing this thing again, call me on, So that level of transparency, openness, and willingness to confront the egoic blind spots that led to poor decisions is really important, because I don't think the company truly transforms until the leadership owns it. Now, sometimes you get leaders who are coming in from the outside, and that's a different story. But if it's the same leader, the same founders, the same people who are sticking with the company, following its transformation, then they also have to own their own transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. And would you recommend always having an outsider involved to run this process, or have you seen this work successfully when it's run internally?
I think there's some things you can do internally, and then there's some things that are better served externally. If you recall in the chapter, I talk about my friend Raj Kapoor, who was doing a startup, and he was a former VC, he'd been around for a long time, second, third time entrepreneur in this case. And he still was suffering some of the same problems, and that he's a really good salesperson, and he was selling himself on the fact that his company was going to win. And he had to have a personal board of advisors tell him, hey, it's over. You did your best you could, but you're selling yourself on something that isn't real, right? And it's not just transforming in order to figure out your company's second act. Sometimes it's transforming in order to see that the company shouldn't be in existence as an independent entity anymore. And that's okay, right? And the important thing is having the truth. So I think there's some things that can happen in the company, like doing a 360-degree review. I think board members can be helpful to the coaching process for CEOs. But I think it's also really important to have people who are not connected to the business and know you really well, right? And so I have a personal board of directors and people who know me, love me, and will offer me unvarnished feedback on life decisions and business decisions I make. And sometimes you need that.
I love that. I don't think I'd heard of that before your book, the personal board directors. So talk about yours and how you would recommend others put together their own personal board of directors.
Yeah. In my case, these are people who I respect from a career perspective, people who know me really well and have known me over a period of time, who have a deeper sense of my old patterns and negative biases.
Yeah.
And people who love me, and I think love is really important. And we don't talk about it enough in business, but love is the WD-40 for these conversations. WD-40 being the lubricant, that I find that not people all know when I say WD-40 what I mean. It makes all these conversations smoother, right? Because I know they have my best interest at heart, and because of that, I will solicit strong feedback from them and really ask for them to tell it like it is, and for them to help guide me in a decision that may be hard to do on my own. And so I think, having a handful of people, call it 5 to 8 people who are in that world for you and you can call on periodically, ideally people who are 20, 30 years older, who have been through what you've been through, as well as people your same age, and maybe even a younger person too, and that's great. But but don't have just people who look like you, think like you, are in the same
Right.
position as you.
Yeah.
Make
Yeah.
it a diverse group of people, and age and gender and race and everything. Try to find the collective of people who represent your ideal community to help you make some of these decisions. And I found it to be super helpful.
There were so many great takeaways in the book. Not only great anecdotes in your story, but there's just a lot of good practical advice and, pretty specific advice for how to go about implementing some of these things in a company or a turnaround. So thank you. It's really one of the best business books I've read in a long time, and I read lots of them. So thanks, Dave. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for spending time with us.
Great. Thank you so much for having me again. Yeah, it's called Reignition. It comes out on April 22nd. It's available for pre-order now, and appreciate all the support. And can I quote you on that for the testimonials on my site?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to get my whole leadership team to read this. I want to get all of Lighter Capital's portfolio companies to read this. So I just think it's fantastic. But thank you for spending the time and for sharing your honest story, the ups and downs.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for doing what you do.
Thanks again to Dave Hersh. And to learn more about Dave and pre-order his book, you can go to davehersh.com. That's DAVEHERSH.com. Ready to fuel your future on your terms? Subscribe to Bootstrap, the lighter side. You'll get ideas for growing your startup from other successful founders who grew their businesses without giving up equity or control. This podcast can be found on Apple and Google Podcasts or directly at lightercapital.com/podcast. Until next time, keep your runways long and keep those lights on.